They found the bones first, not buried, not arranged, just scattered where the floor had rotted away. Pale arcs of ribs half sunk into blackened soil, finger bones threaded through ash like teeth in a burned mouth. The smell never left the men who entered that house. Even decades later, they would say it clung to them. Old smoke, old blood, something sweet and wrong beneath it. The walls were scorched from the inside, as if the fire had started in the lungs of the place, and burned outward, choking on its own history. In one corner, fused into melted glass and rusted iron, lay a child's shoe. Too small, too worn, as if it had never been taken off. No one screamed when the door was opened. Whatever had screamed there had done so years before, when there was still breath to tear apart. The valley where this happened did not exist on most maps. A fold in the Appalachian spine, where the hills pressed together tightly enough to keep secrets warm. Fog settled there early and left late, seeping into wood grain, into skin, into memory. People nearby said sound behaved strangely in that hollow. Voices traveled farther than they should. Crying sometimes came from places no one lived anymore, or maybe never had. The men who entered that house in 1954 were not looking for bones. They were looking for stories. Vanishing families. Names that had stopped appearing in church books. Births that were recorded once, then never again. They carried cameras and notebooks, thinking they were archivists of a dying way of life. They did not understand they were stepping into the aftermath of something that had already collapsed under its own weight. Before the fire, before the bones, there had been a family. Before the family, a vow. Before the vow, a fear so old it had grown roots. If you're listening to this now, pause for a moment. Which city are you watching from? And what time is it right now? Some stories need to know where they land. Some histories behave differently, depending on the hour they're heard. The path into the valley narrowed, as if the mountain itself were reconsidering the decision to let anyone pass. Trees leaned inward, their branches knitting overhead. The ground showed no wagon tracks, no fresh prints, only the compressed silence of land that had learned not to expect visitors. Locals called it Reddick Hollow, though no one could remember who had given it that name. They only knew that male never went there. Census takers stopped trying, and children learned early which ridge not to cross. In the county courthouse, a single ledger page listed the Reddicks. Ink faded almost to nothing, names repeating themselves, dates overlapping in ways that made no sense, marriages recorded without witnesses, births without fathers, deaths without causes. The page ended abruptly, as if whoever had been writing it chose to stop rather than continue tracing the shape forming beneath their pen. And somewhere in that hollow, long before the fire cleansed the walls, but not the ground, a child was born who should not have been possible. The valley had been settled backward, not from road to hollow, but from hollow inward, as if the people who came there were trying to erase their own tracks. Old survey maps from the 1830s showed a blank where Reddick Hollow would later be penciled in by hand. The ink thinner than elsewhere, uncertain. The land itself resisted measurement. Creeks split and vanished underground. Limestone swallowed sound. Winter arrived earlier there and stayed longer, pressing its weight into roofs and bones alike. County histories mentioned a preacher passing through once, noting a family who refused baptism because they claimed to already belong to something older than the church. His journal ended abruptly after that entry. No explanation. Just an unfinished sentence trailing off, like a thought interrupted by fear. The Reddicks came into the hollow in the years after the first great revival fires, burned through Appalachia. Times when belief hardened into rules and rules into blood. The man who led them, according to the few surviving scraps of testimony, believed the outside world was rotting faster than flesh left in the sun. He taught his children that salvation required sealing themselves away, not just from cities and roads, but from other families. Strangers carried corruption, outsiders carried decay. Blood, if kept close enough, could be purified through suffering. By the early 20th century, no one remembered a time when the Reddicks had married anyone else. They did not attend school. They did not register births unless pressed. They did not bury their dead in marked ground. They folded them back into the hillside, returning what had failed to the place that demanded it. It was during a winter that split trees with cold that the child was born. No midwife came, no doctor. Only women whose hands already shook from too many similar nights. The labor lasted long enough that neighbors, miles away, later said they heard something carrying through the fog. Not words, just the sound of air being torn apart again and again. When the child finally arrived, silence followed. Then a cry that was thin and uneven, like something struggling to remember how lungs worked. They wrapped the body quickly, not looking too closely at first. There was relief that it breathed at all. But as days passed, the differences became impossible to ignore. The eyes did not track together. One shoulder sat higher than the other. Fingers curled inward, refusing to straighten fully. The child did not cry the way other babies did. It made sounds more like low whimpers, as if conserving energy for something unseen. They named it after a grandfather, and then after a great-grandmother, collapsing generations into a single word. Names in that family did not move forward. They folded back on themselves. As the child grew, it watched more than it played. It learned the woods faster than speech. It seemed to recognize relatives not by face but by smell, reacting with comfort or distress in ways no one could explain. At night, it sometimes woke screaming before it could walk, clawing at the air as if trying to push something away that others could not see. The family called it sensitive, touched, chosen. No one yet spoke the word cursed. That came later, when the drawings began appearing on the cabin walls, etched in charcoal and ash, showing circles that closed too tightly, figures with too many joints, and a house burning from the inside out. By the time the child could stand without falling, the hollow had already begun to whisper about it. Not loudly. Appalachia never spoke loud about its fears. The rumors moved through pauses in conversation, through looks exchanged at the edge of churchyards, through the way dogs refused to follow certain scents up the ridge. People said the Reddicks, youngest, walked like an old person, head tilted, spine curved, as if already carrying years that had not yet happened. They said it watched adults with an intensity that made skin prickle, as though trying to remember something it had once known and lost. The child did not attend gatherings, but sometimes stood at the tree line when voices drifted up from the valley below. When laughter rose, it flinched. When hymns carried, it went still, listening so hard its mouth fell open slightly, breath shallow. Music, especially, seemed to disturb it. Notes stretched and bent in its hearing, becoming something else. Inside the cabin, days followed a pattern unchanged for generations. Cornmeal, game, silence broken only by work. The adults spoke little to the child, not out of cruelty but necessity. Too many of their children had not lasted long. Attachment was dangerous. Love, in that hollow, was rationed carefully. As the child aged, the differences sharpened. Growth came unevenly. One leg lengthened faster than the other. teeth crowded in strange directions. Illness arrived often and lingered. Fevers that should have passed instead burned low for weeks, leaving the child weaker, eyes glassy and unfocused. And yet it survived. Again and again it survived. At night, neighbors claimed to hear noises drifting from the hollow. Not screams exactly. More like conversations spoken too softly to understand, rising and falling in rhythm, as if someone were rehearsing lines meant for another voice. Once, a hunter passing too close saw he heard a child speaking in two tones at once, one higher, one low and broken, overlapping like an echo chasing itself. The parents insisted nothing was wrong. This child was a blessing. Proof that the blood still held. They pointed to ancestors who had lived into old age, despite crooked limbs and dim eyesight. Suffering was not a sign of failure. It was confirmation. But the drawings continued. Animals with ribs showing through skin, yet still walking. Family trees with branches looping back into their trunks. Figures standing between two adults who shared the same face. The charcoal was sometimes mixed with something darker, smeared with fingers that shook. Dead animals began appearing near the cabin. Not eaten, not skinned, just laid out carefully. Bones arranged with a precision that felt deliberate. When questioned, the family blamed predators. The child said nothing. It watched. By the time the child reached an age when most would have been sent to school, it had already learned things no one had taught it. It knew which relatives would sicken before symptoms appeared. It avoided certain corners of the cabin without explanation. And once, when a newborn cousin failed to breathe, the child turned away before the adults noticed anything was wrong, as if it had expected the silence. The first time the word incest was spoken aloud in connection with the Reddicks, it was whispered by a midwife who never returned to the hollow again. She told her sister that something there had folded in on itself too many times. That blood was remembering things it was never meant to remember. The child grew, carrying that memory in its bones, as the family tree tightened around it like a noose woven slowly over generations. As seasons turned, the hollow changed its behavior. Fog thickened, lingering even at midday. Smoke from the Reddick chimney rose straight up, and then collapsed back down, as if the air itself rejected it. Chickens stopped laying. Dogs refused to cross the creek that marked the edge of the family's land. When storms came, thunder seemed to circle rather than pass, rolling back on itself in long, exhausted groans. The child entered a phase the family could not name. Sleep fractured into short intervals. It woke gasping, skin slick with cold sweat, whispering fragments of sentences that did not belong to a child's mouth. Sometimes it used words that no one in the cabin remembered teaching it. Names, repeated softly, over and over, many belonging to the dead. Ritual crept into daily life unnoticed at first. Meals were eaten in silence facing the same direction. Certain tools were placed back in exact positions after use. Firewood was stacked according to a pattern that mirrored the drawings on the walls. The child insisted on these things, becoming agitated if they were disturbed. When corrected, it screamed with a strength that did not match its body, voice tearing raw, as if dragged from somewhere deeper than lungs. At night, a light sometimes flickered in the third structure, the one no one slept in anymore. Family members claimed it was reflection, moon on glass, imagination fueled by exhaustion. But visitors passing at a distance saw movement. A small shape pacing, pausing, pressing its face against the dark. The child began to speak of itself in plural, not always, only when frightened or angry, or pressed with questions it did not want to answer. "We don't like that," it would say. voice flattening. "We remember when that hurt." The parents corrected it gently, then sharply, then not at all. Drawings shifted from charcoal to scratches cut directly into wood. Symbols repeated. Circles closing. Lines crossing where they should not. One image appeared again and again, a woman standing beside a man who shared her face. Their shadows merging into a single shape that bent down toward a child whose limbs twisted inward, unnaturally. Animals continued to die, smaller ones at first. Then a goat, found with its neck broken, but no signs of struggle. The family blamed sickness. Wolves, God's will. No one wanted to name the pattern forming. The child grew taller, then stopped abruptly, bones aching visibly beneath skin. Puberty came wrong, early and uneven, bringing bleeding, pain. Confusion that no one had language for. The parents avoided looking too closely. The hollow had taught them that some knowledge invited consequences. It was during this time that screams were heard most often. Not constant, not predictable, short. Sharp eruptions that cut through the night and vanished, leaving silence so complete it felt deliberate. Neighbors lay awake counting seconds afterward, waiting for something else to follow. Nothing ever did. By the time outsiders would later arrive, the house was already rotting from the inside. Belief had hardened into habit, habit into ritual, ritual into something that no longer needed explanation. And at the center of it all stood a child who was not just born into the family, but born from it in ways that should have ended long before it drew breath. The truth did not arrive all at once. It never does. It seeped in through inconsistencies, through answers that bent when questioned, through the way names repeated too often for coincidence. When the men with notebooks finally sat at the Reddick table, they noticed how the family spoke about relationships without clear edges. Mother and aunt used interchangeably. Cousin and brother blurred together. The language had worn thin from carrying too much weight. One of the women, pressed gently about the child's father, hesitated too long. Her eyes flicked toward the older man by the hearth, then toward the boy standing half, hidden behind her skirts. When she spoke, the answer did not settle. It shifted. First one name, then another, finally silence. The family tree, when drawn, refused to behave like a tree. It curved inward. Branches looped back into the trunk. Marriages connected siblings. Uncles became fathers. Mothers shared blood too closely with their husbands to be explained away by distance or accident. What had begun generations earlier as a single cousin union had repeated until the distinctions that protected bodies and minds had dissolved entirely. The child at the center of it all was not just the product of inbreeding. It was the convergence point. Its mother was also its aunt. Its father shared blood with her through multiple lines. Genetically, the child carried fewer unique markers than should have been possible in a human being. It was a narrowing made flesh. When this was spoken aloud, the room went still, not shocked, not angry, resigned. As if a truth long understood privately had finally been dragged into the light, where it could no longer be ignored. The older generation insisted this was how it had always been, how it had to be. The blood was sacred. Outside blood brought rot. This pain was proof of purity, not corruption. The child listened without expression. When asked if it understood who its parents were, it nodded once. Then, after a pause, it corrected the question. It named 3 people instead of 2. That was when the men noticed the way the adults flinched. Stories emerged then, reluctantly, of daughters chosen because no outsiders were available, of sons taught that desire was duty, of nights when the rules of kinship were suspended in the name of survival. These were not acts spoken of with pleasure. They were framed as obligations, burdens carried, so the family could continue existing at all. The child had been born knowing this, absorbing it through glances and silences, long before anyone explained it. Its confusion was not about identity. It was about inevitability. It had seen its future reflected in its elders' bodies, bent and failing, and understood that escape was not part of the design. The drawings made sense now. The merged faces, the closed circles, the figures with too many joints, too few boundaries. The screams heard at night were not madness. They were recognition. By the time the truth fully surfaced, it was already too late to undo what generations had done to themselves. Knowledge did not break the cycle. It only revealed how tightly it had been wounded. And outside the hollow, word began to spread, not as rumor now, but as something heavier, something that demanded response. The town did not react with curiosity. It reacted with fear sharpened into anger. Word moved fast once it left the hollow, stripped of nuance, hardened into shapes people could strike. Incest, deformity, sin nesting unchecked in the hills. The church bells rang on a weekday, summoning men who did not ask why they were needed, only where to gather. They went up the mountain at dusk, carrying lanterns and the kind of quiet that comes when a decision has already been made. No one spoke of law, no one spoke of mercy. They told themselves they were protecting their children from something that should never have been allowed to exist. When they reached the Reddick place, the family did not resist. Some stood frozen, others wept without sound. The child watched from the doorway, head tilted, as if studying a conclusion it had already foreseen. The men did not look at it directly. Eyes slid away, unsettled by the way its gaze lingered too long. Animals were slaughtered first. Not for food, for erasure. Blood soaked into soil already dark with older stains. Then came the records. Family Bibles torn apart, pages scattered and burned. Names erased so thoroughly it would be as if they had never been spoken at all. The house caught fire quickly. Dry wood. Years of resin and smoke trapped in its beams. Flames climbed the walls like they had been waiting. The heat forced everyone back. Someone shouted a prayer. Someone else shouted for haste. The child screamed once, then stopped abruptly, sound cut short in a way that made several men turn pale. By morning, nothing stood but blackened posts and drifting ash. The hollow smelled cleaner, they said, purged. No one went back to search for bodies. No one counted bones. The assumption was enough. Whatever had lived there was over. For years afterward, the town avoided speaking of it. Children were warned away from the ridge, without explanation. When hunters passed near the hollow, they felt watched and moved on quickly. Grass refused to grow where the house had burned hottest. Decades later, a researcher in the 1980s would find the gaps. The missing census entries, the abrupt end of church records, a photograph misfiled in a county archive showing a burned foundation and a small, crooked footprint in ash that did not match any known shoe size. He followed the trail backward, piecing together what others had tried to erase. Genetic notes, handwritten letters, a reel of damaged film labeled only with a date and the word family. When he watched it, alone in a university basement, he understood why no one had wanted the story preserved. Because the child in the footage was not dead. It was older, scarred, and staring directly into the camera, as if it had been waiting decades for someone to look back. The researcher's name barely appears in the records, reduced to initials in most citations, as if even decades later the story resisted being fully attached to a living person. He came to it sideways, not hunting horror but patterns, disappearances, Anomalies in Appalachian genealogies, where bloodlines narrowed too fast, where death rates spiked without epidemic or war to explain them. The Reddick gap stood out immediately. Too clean. Too deliberate. In a county storage room that smelled of dust and old glue, he found a box that did not belong with the others. No accession number, no proper label. Inside were fragments, a charred ledger spine, a Bible cover without pages, and a single photograph, cracked down the middle, showing a child standing barefoot in front of a cabin. The body was twisted slightly to one side. The eyes looked wrong even in stillness, unfocused yet intent, as if tracking something just beyond the frame. The film reel surfaced later, misfiled under agricultural surveys. When he threaded it through a projector, the machine groaned in protest, lights stuttering across warped celluloid. The footage was brief. A family standing too close together. Faces sharing angles they should not have shared. And then the child. Older than in the photograph, taller. Its posture bent in a way that suggested pain, carried constantly. When it turned toward the camera, the researcher felt something tighten in his chest. Recognition without memory. A sensation like being named by someone you've never met. The notes accompanying the reel were worse. Handwritten observations from a visiting doctor in the 1950s, careful and restrained, documenting degrees of relatedness that collapsed the concept of parent and sibling entirely. Margins filled with calculations, then crossed out, then rewritten, as if the numbers themselves were being argued with. One sentence repeated 3 times in different phrasing, each attempt failing to soften it. Genetic convergence incompatible with long-term viability, and yet the footage contradicted that conclusion. The child lived, it moved, it spoke. The researcher followed rumors next. Reports from the late 1950s of a woman and several children appearing in a West Virginia town, claiming to have lost everything in a fire. No birth certificates. No school records before a certain year. Medical files thick with surgeries, institutional transfers, long-term care. One name appeared briefly, then vanished into redaction. By the 1990s, DNA studies confirmed what the paper trail suggested. An individual carrying markers consistent with extreme generational inbreeding. Levels rarely seen outside controlled experiments. The body bore the cost. The mind carried the rest. The researcher never published everything he found. Some things resist clean conclusions. In his private notes, he wrote that the Reddick story was not about monstrosity, but momentum. What happens when belief, fear, and blood are allowed to fold in on themselves without interruption. The last page of his notebook ended with a question, written smaller than the rest, as if afraid of being seen. What survives when a family burns itself away? The answer began to surface in fragments, not as revelation, but as residue. Hospital corridors remembered footsteps long after names were changed. Case files described a patient whose spine never fully straightened, whose joints stiffened early, whose eyes struggled to focus in unison. Therapists noted speech patterns that slipped under stress, plural pronouns surfacing without conscious intent. Doctors treated bodies. No one knew how to treat inheritance. Those who encountered the survivor described a presence that unsettled without threat. Quiet. Watchful. A person who listened as if weighing every word against something internal and ancient. Family, when asked about origins, was spoken of vaguely like a place half remembered from dreams. Fire. Mountains. Silence. Beyond that, refusal. The legacy of the hollow lingered in subtler ways. Researchers cited the case in footnotes, careful not to dwell too long. Genetic counselors used anonymized charts to explain how blood, folded too tightly, begins to echo itself. Anthropologists argued over autonomy and intervention, over when belief becomes harm, and who has the right to decide. None of them had stood in that valley at dawn, where ash once cooled into soil that would not grow. The land itself remained altered. Trees grew crooked near the old foundation, roots pushing away from something buried too deep to name. Hunters reported equipment failing without reason, compasses wavering. Locals avoided the place not out of superstition, but out of exhaustion. Some histories cost too much to carry forward. In the end, what survived was not the family as it had been. It was the consequence, a single line bent but unbroken, moving through institutions and paperwork and quiet rooms where lights never fully dimmed. The cycle had not ended cleanly. It had fractured, scattering its pieces across decades. The researcher closed his files, knowing there would be no final certainty. Only this isolation does not preserve purity. It concentrates damage. Love, when trapped inside fear, becomes another instrument of harm, and somewhere, a person born from that hollow carried the weight of choices made long before they drew breath, living proof that blood remembers even when records burn. Imagine discovering that your body is an archive, that every ache, every scar, every limitation is a sentence written by people you never met, repeating themselves until language collapsed into flesh. Imagine learning that your mother was also your sister, that your father shared the same blood twice over, that your existence was not an accident, but an inevitability shaped by fear disguised as faith. The Reddick Hollow does not ask to be judged. It asks to be understood, not excused. Understood. The family believed they were protecting themselves from corruption. In doing so, they sealed it inside their own blood, generation after generation, until the distinction between protector and predator dissolved. When the house burned, the town believed the story ended. Fire has always been used to make endings feel complete, but fire only erases surfaces. What lies beneath survives, altered but persistent. In this case, it walked out of the mountains years later, carrying a new name and the same inheritance. The final cruelty of the story is this: the child at its center never chose any of it. Not the vows made in the 1830s. Not the marriages that folded the family inward. Not the rituals, the screams, the silence. Survival was the only thing it ever did intentionally, and even that came at a cost that followed it into every room it would ever enter. History prefers clean lessons. This one refuses them. It offers instead a question that lingers uncomfortably, long after the names fade and the footage stops. What would you do if you learned the people who gave you life were also the ones who quietly destroyed it? And how far would you go to break a cycle that began long before you were born? The hollow never answers. It only remembers.